out of the picture by Arthur Machen. Chapter 1. In the old days, which means anything from 10 to 30 years ago, there was a question which used to be asked now and then at studio parties and Chelsea pubs. The question was, but who was the twisted man? And it was often followed by another. But where did McCalmont take himself off to? Neither interrogation ever got an answer, save that to the second query, a young man in very full dark green corduroy trousers is reported to have said once on a time, "Somebody told me he had been seen in Quito." But to this neither credit nor attention was given, and it is probable from what follows that the double enigma is to be reckoned with that question as to what song the sirens sang, if indeed it is not past all solution. Going back, then, to those old days aforesaid, and rather to the earlier portion of them, when, as a journalist, I saw many strange things and people, I was once sent to view an exhibition of pictures at the Molyneux Galleries in Danby Place. Perhaps the event may be sufficiently dated by saying that the exhibition was opened somewhere between the Battle of Sidney Street and the coronation of King George V, and I have a feeling that it was a misty May morning when I went to see it. It was not a large exhibition. All the pictures were contained in 2 sizable rooms, and as soon as I got into them, I saw at once that I could make nothing of it, that is, from any serious standpoint. I cared nothing. My point of view in that instance, as in all others like it, was that if the paper chose to send an outsider and an ignoramus to criticize works of art, especially the works of a new and tentative and experimental school, then on the head of the paper let the just doom fall. And the school represented on this particular occasion at the Molyneux Galleries evidently represented a fierce revolt against the traditions and conventions of the elders. To begin with, my eye was caught by the Old Harbor. There were buildings in vertical perspective, their walls appearing to incline together and to aspire to meet in the upper part of the canvas, and with a sense about them as if the whole mass were unstable, impermanent, void of true solidity and settlement on the earth. A mystic once told me that after he had finished his meditation and gone out into the street, he had seen the gray bulk of the houses opposite suddenly melt, evaporate, go up like smoke, leaving void nothingness in their place. And so the painter, with his art, had made these warehouses and customs buildings, or whatever they were, in such a fashion that they seemed as if they also were on the very point to turn to mist, to float into the air, and to disappear. And then, for the rest, there was gray water, and segments, and portions, and particles of keels, sails, masts, ropes, decks, and deck furniture, not cohering or fitting together, but dispersed and apart. Here, I could see, was choice matter on which the expert and art critic could exercise their knowledge and judgment. As I had neither, I made an experiment or two, and was able to inform the readers of the paper that if you walked briskly past the picture, winking both eyes as fast as possible, you really got a sort of impression of movement and activity, of ships and boats coming into harbor and sailing out of it, of sails lowered and hoisted, of an uncertain background, now obscured, now left visible, as a ship in full sail passed before it. It struck me that, in my hands, art criticism was, in a fair way, to become a popular sport. And then there was another picture that both attracted and distracted me. It was a big canvas, and the subject was a number of geometrical figures of all kinds, most ingeniously fitted into one another, and rainbow painted, no doubt on some occult principle of contrast and complement and correspondence. It was called King Solomon's Cargoes. I murmured, "Gold and silver and ivory and apes and peacocks," and looked for them. I could not see any of them, and I thought I would go back to Fleet Street, relying on my impressions of the Old Harbor, which would just fill the 2 sticks that had been allotted to the story. It was, decidedly, a case of least said, soonest mended. In spite of the defense which, as I have mentioned, I had ready, I felt I was on unsafe and treacherous ground. Who was I to sit in judgment on the work of painters? No doubt I might say that I had looked for apes and peacocks in that picture and had found none. And, likely enough, that remark might merely serve to display my utter ignorance of the subject I was pretending to treat. But it was not written that I should escape King Solomon's cargoes so easily. It was some years after the exhibition at the Monet galleries that I found myself in a various company one evening. I saw a few people that I knew, and was talking to one of them, when the friend who had brought me along came and said, "Do you mind if I introduce you to a man? It's Machen, the painter, who says he's been wanting to meet you for years. Some criticism of yours that he read seems to have made a great impression on him." He took me up to a dark, slight man with a black mustache, and left me. Machen made room on the settee and began at once. "I've been wanting to thank you for a long time for that notice you wrote in your paper about the exhibition in the Monet galleries. You'll remember, it was in the coronation year." I told him I thought I did remember something about it, but I wondered, internally, what sort of thanks I was going to get from a painter for my vain ribaldry. He went on, "I said to myself at the time, this A.M., whoever he may be, has got an eye to detect the falsities and fallacies, and I'd like to have a talk with him. Then somebody told me your name, but I left town soon after, and this is the first chance I've had." And finally it came to this, that the falsities and fallacies were the picture of The Old Harbor by Frank Guilford, and Machen had enjoyed the way I had stuck my knife into the fellow. I explained. I said I knew nothing about painting, and had been afraid that I had been guilty of ill-placed and unmannerly humor. He wouldn't hear of this. "It was just instinct, pure instinct. You may not have the technical knowledge, but you know a silly man when you see him." I asked what had become of this unhappy man. "He's what they call a fashionable painter, and makes his 8,000 a year by painting grocers and their wives. Damn him." And he went on. "I don't know whether you happened to see a thing I had in that exhibition. I called it King Solomon's Cargoes." I lied. I dwelt again, and more forcibly, on the utter unscrupulousness of my character when simulating an art critic. I said I had not seen his canvas. I had just dashed into the galleries, invented my silly game with the ships in the harbor, and ran out again as soon as I had got material for my 2 or 3 paragraphs. But, in fact, I remembered those purple squares, scarlet triangles, sky-blue circles very well. Machen nodded his head gloomily. "I'm glad it didn't catch your eye. You might have had something to say to me, too. You'd have been right. And you'd have been wrong. I was never a faker like Guildford. I never pretended that if you painted a bit of mast here and a scrap of sail there and a deck in another part of the canvas, you could call it painting a ship. But I did believe in abstract painting, and I still do, in a way." I asked him to tell me all about it. "I'd like to explain what I was after in those days. You say you know nothing about the technical side of painting. You won't want to know anything about it. It's not a technical question. It's behind all that and beyond it. But you can't talk sense in the middle of all these havers. Come away." I followed him out, and by devious and obscure ways he led me to an obscure tavern, where we sat down together in a quiet corner of a bulging and old-fashioned bar. They spoke his language there, since his order for 2 wee halfins was fulfilled without comment. But I looked at the stuff in my glass, and remembered how the poet had said that the half is greater than the whole. Greater, I corrected mentally, than the double. I added water. "Don't kill good drink," Machen said reproachfully. "Scelus est jugulare falernum." And this is better. It's the genuine Lagavulin, not the trash they sell in London for whiskey. But you were asking about abstract painting. It will be necessary to go back and away a little if we're to see what we're after. They say distance lends enchantment to a view. I'd put it myself, lends vision, Fioria. It may turn out, of course, that when you do see, you see enchantment, but that is just secondary, a kind of byproduct, you might say, of the proposition. I'll ask you then if you know anything about the Kabbalah of the Hebrews. Whatever I knew of that matter, I dissembled. I am a lover of the rich improbabilities, and I would not check this rare manifestation of them. Well, I don't want you to feel like a cow in a fremd loaming, so I won't go too deeply into these dark mysteries. But the Kabbalists tell us that at the fall of man, the serpent did not ascend to Kether in the tree of life. It stopped at Doth, and that's their way of saying the nature of man was not entirely corrupted. The serpent poisoned and infected the logical understanding, but there was a pure spiritual region above that which remained untouched. Very good, you see that, and there you have the reason why a man that sunk deep in the blackest mud of materialism may very possibly be overcome with delight at the fugues of Bach. You'll see how that may be. That's absolute music. It has nothing to do with Doth, the logical understanding. I'm speaking, you understand, of the pattern of sounds that reaches the ears of the hearer. Just the ordered noises that he hears, if you like to put it that way. In the making of the music, no doubt, in the technical part of the creation, the understanding had its share, as the slave of the spirit. If you want to build Jerusalem with its temple, you must have your hewers of wood and stone and drawers of water. You're a writer yourself, and you know you can't do much in that way without calling in the aid of the pen makers and the ink manufacturers and paper merchants. But you don't allow them to teach you how to turn the phrase. But the way the thing is fashioned is nothing to do with us. What we're concerned with is the thing we hear. And with that thing, the logical understanding has just no concern at all. You'll note there's no tongue or language in which we can speak of it. There's no answer to the question, but what does it mean? When that question is asked of pure music. Bach, you may say, had the gift of tongues, but in his case there's no legitimate gift of the interpretation of tongues. It's impossible to translate the language of Kether into the speech of Doth. I remember well going to hear Lohengrin, and there was a manner of commentary attached to the bill of the opera. I just glanced at it, and saw that when the overture began, I was to picture to myself a blue sky, and then to watch the wee white clouds forming on it. There you have your music critic calling in nature, and I saw in the paper there was another of them puzzling his head over Berlioz, and decided that he was a pictorial, not a linear, composer, calling in the terms of another art. And you'll hear often enough of the magnificent color of this or that passage of music. And I don't say they can do better, but it proves what I am telling you, that the understanding has nothing to do with absolute music, and nothing to say to it. Aye, and what about painting? That's the question I asked myself years ago. You know Aristotle says that all art is imitation. It's a very questionable pronouncement. If I'm not mistaken, he had the drama chiefly in his mind when he made it. But the drama is just an impure or mixed development of the dance. In its primitive, original form, the dance was not an imitation of anything. It was, like music, an expression of something, but that's different. You may say that the drama of the Greeks was the dance set to words. And then there's architecture. You can't say that the Parthenon is an imitation of anything, or that Rheims Cathedral is an imitation of anything. And literature, I shan't need to tell you that all the things we value most in the finest literature are just the things that soar above the sense, that is, the logical understanding of it. If you turn to the book and read 2 Samuel 1:17, you'll find a statement to the effect that David lamented the decease of Saul and Jonathan, but you'll not tell me that the vital interest and value of that proposition is to be discovered in the logical sense of it. And if you read Coleridge's Kubla Khan, I think you'll be puzzled to find out the logical sense in it, and to tell me what it is. But there you have literature almost becoming music. And now you see what I've been getting at all the while. I did not, but I forbore to say so. It was just this, that I asked myself, why should there not be abstract or absolute painting, as well as absolute music and architecture? In the past, painting has been almost entirely Aristotelian, imitative. Why should it continue wholly on those lines? And you'll have gathered that I don't consider you solved the problem by cracking an object up into bits and scraps and pieces, and then painting the bits as they lie abroad. And if you paint a man's hands 3 times their natural size, and draw a jackass with 5 legs, I'm not thinking you're any nearer to a solution. And that's how I came to paint the picture that I sent into those galleries that I'm glad now you didn't see. I was on the wrong track. He lapsed at last into silence. I broke it by making a proposition remote from pure aesthetics. He declined to accede to it. No, no, said McCalmont, I'll not hear of it. In the Crown and Thistle, I'm in Scotland, and you're my guest. Where's the McFarlane creature? When we parted soon after, he wrote his address on a scrap of paper torn from his notebook, and begged me to come and see him one evening. I'd like to show you the new track I've found, he said, and vanished into the night as we came out together. Chapter 2. It may be as well to make it clear at once that I am not the man to be daunted by the unusual. I have seen too much of it for that. I know that there are quarters, and very influential quarters, in which it is considered improper to mention such things. Every age has its conventions of propriety and impropriety. Every age and every race. The missionary's wife in Africa shocked her 2 black servants horribly and unspeakably when she said that she was afraid the fruit was too green for a tart. Her husband's name was green, and everybody knows that for a wife to utter her husband's name is both impious and obscene in the highest degree. We talk quite freely in the drawing-room, in a style that would have made Dickens run out of the smoking-room, and when we write books, we set down boldly words that were only forced out of the policeman of yesterday by the strict order of the bench. It is all a matter of convention and taboo, and perhaps it is idle to ask for reasons. Mrs. Green, I dare say, couldn't understand why on earth she shouldn't utter the word green, and I suppose I am in much the same case when I say I have no notion why I shouldn't mention the unusual, the odd, the extraordinary, when I come across it. At any rate, I propose to defy this particular convention, here and elsewhere, and always. As I was saying, I have seen too much of it to affect disbelief in its existence. I heard from the brass founders of Clerkenwell about a former member of their craft who had confuted Darwin by the Hebrew alphabet and by the stars, and had buried the pot of gold in a field, where it was found by the navvies who were making the cutting for the Midland Railway. I have discussed with a solicitor in his London office the affairs of the J.H.V.S. Syndicate, who were seeking for the Ark of the Covenant from the directions of a cipher contained in that chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, which is called Merkabah. I know all about Campo Tosto of Burnt Green, near Reigate, who defended his treasures with the bow and arrow. Why, then, should I hush up McCalmont, the painter, who drew his artistic principles from the Hebrew Kabbalah? As a matter of fact, I thought him an interesting man, and determined that I would see more of him. And so, one windy night in October, a few weeks after our meeting, I set out from somewhere in the west and made up the Gray's Inn Road. I am not certain by which street I turned from it. I think, but I am not sure, that it was by Acton Street. I know that I had gone too far north, and that when I came to the bottom of the street and traversed the King's Cross Road, I found out my mistake and had to incline somewhat to the right in climbing the hill. It is a district both devious and obscure, and I suppose that its twisting streets and unexpected squares of dusty trees will all come to ruin before they are intelligently explored. I had trod these mazes before, and thought I knew them tolerably well, but it was some years since I had been in that region, and I found myself perplexed and at fault, while the great wind blew the leaves of shadowy trees about my head and at my feet. At last I entered a black passage at a juncture, and came down a short flight of steps into an irregular open space, on which there abutted a chapel of the Countess of Huntington's connection. I went round and about this square, or triangle, or trapezium, which was sparsely lit, till I found the green door in a wall to which I was directed, and rang the bell under the name McCalmont. It was McCalmont who opened the door, and, taking hold of my arm, led me down a passage, past a house all lit up where they were singing, and so to his studio, with trees all about it, bending and tossing and straining in the wind. Inside there was a hanging lamp, and though it was not cold, the blazing of the fire was cheerful, and lamplight and firelight glittered on the carved and gilded frames of the pictures that hung on the walls. We sat down on a big settee at a comfortable distance from the fire, and he pressed on my attention what he called Ila, which is spelt, I found, Islay. And then there was more of it, not of the spirit of the Western Isle, but of art, as he expounded it. It seemed that he had been forced to modify, one might say to abandon, his earlier views. I found out, and I was not so long about it, that you can't have absolute painting any more than you can have absolute literature. There are people, as you know, who are trying their hands at that, by writing gibberish without grammar, and that won't do, and I discovered that my endeavors in the direction of pure painting wouldn't do either. The principle of it is all right, but it's not for pigments. If you would carry it out, you must turn Eastern carpet maker, and I'll maintain that there are Persian carpets as fine as any symphony of Beethoven's. They are the very analogy in color and form of pure music. As it seemed that I couldn't go forward, I went back, and there, as you'll no doubt be well aware, I was in the height of the fashion. The sculptors and painters, too, have been trying back for the last quarter of a century. There are men who do their best to forget all the bare elements of their art, their drawing and their perspective, and all the rest of it, that they may paint as if they were 5 years old. Another lot are off to Borriaboola Gha to learn the principles of sculpture from black savages, and I've no doubt there's a wary band trying to tramp all the way back to the Stone Age to see what they can find there. It's all very interesting. I'd like it fine if they'd not call their imitations of barbarism modern art. And now I shall show you where I've gone back myself, so as to be in the movement. He barked derisively, and turning up the lamp a little, proceeded to guide me round the studio, and I felt as helpless and as futile as I had been in the old days when I was an art critic pour rire. For I was not at all sure where he had gone back, to use his own phrase. The pictures were all landscapes, painted, I conjecture, in the manner of the 18th century. There seemed to me, the uninstructed, as it were, a dark shadow that hung over them all. Now and again there were patches of an intense and glowing blue in McCalmont's skies, but these were contrasted with purple cloud masses rimmed with fire, with huge white clouds blown up into the sky by gathering thunder, with cloudy walls of black streaked with coppery flame. The green of the trees and of the grass was dark and livid, and the water of the pools and streams reflected something of the threat of the skies. McCalmont had depicted open spaces in the midst of mysterious woods, narrow valleys edged with grim rocks, paths that wound in and out by lonely lands to shattered walls on a far height, trees of strange growth hanging over a well, glades glooming with twilight, and the coming storm. There was an enchantment, but the incantation was of oppression and terror. There were 3 things that I noticed as curious. The first was that in every picture McCalmont had introduced fire. Logs burning under a broken wall, flames breaking out of yellowish smoke in the forest clearing, a fire by the well, a fire on the far side hill. Water, also, was represented in each canvas, well or brook or pool in the woods, and in every one of them there was the figure of a man, the same man, so far as I could judge. The figure was roughly dressed in the costume of an 18th century countryman, in ragged clothes with a scarlet cap on his head. He was depicted as tending the invariable fire, perhaps, or leaning on his staff, or half hidden behind the trunk of a tree, or crouching among thorns on the border of a broken road. As I passed slowly from picture to picture, I noticed that the figure became more prominent. At first, it was barely seen in the background. Then it came forward into the middle distance, and at the end of the tour, the recently painted pictures, as McCalmont told me, it was prominent in the foreground. In one picture, he led a procession of torchbearers into a wood as the night came on. But mostly he was alone in these desolate places that McCalmont had made. And there was about this figure an impression of distortion. There was no specific deformity, as of hunched back or misshapen limbs, but yet a distinct sense of a form twisted and awry. And the face, where it could be clearly seen, was at once piteous and malignant, as of a stricken snake, wounded and dying. Whatever my feelings about this odd gallery of paintings may have been, I kept it to myself. I reminded McCalmont that I was an outsider, and, perhaps exaggerating a little, that I could never be an admirer of the famous slaughterhouse, since it told no story. "You're an awful liar," he said, with engaging directness, as we sat down again. "But let that flea stick to the wall. I told you I was going back, like the rest, but not to the ignorance of childhood or savagery. I'm returning to a great art and exploring its possibilities. You know that the Gothic architecture was the result of the builders, first of the Dark Ages and then of the Middle Ages, exploring the possibilities of the architecture of the Romans." "I have heard that theory advanced," I said, "but I don't know that it holds the field so decisively as you seem to think. I believe that some authorities would tell you that the Gothicosity of the Gothic derives, to a great extent at least, from the East." "I wouldn't believe a word of that tale, not that it signifies one way or the other in the argument. But I've seen churches down on the Rhone where the Gothic seems growing out of the classic before your very eyes. There's one such at Valence, a regular classic pediment, and all the detail of it one would call Norman if one saw it in England, and anyone who will cast an eye over the first pointed capital will see in a moment that it's a Corinthian capital in disguise, especially if it's got a square abacus." "Very good, then," I assented. "Let us grant your doctrine of Gothic. You're applying it to painting?" "That is so. As I said, I'm exploring the possibilities of an old school of landscape. I don't know whether it's ever struck you, but there's no doubt that some of the painters of that age anticipated the word that came to Coleridge and Wordsworth. The 18th century literature was Pope. It belonged to Doth, the region of the logical understanding. To the men of that age, the poetry of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century was just Egyptian hieroglyphics. They could not interpret a single word of it. They'd forgotten what it meant, and naturally they could not dream of what was to come after them. But if you look at some of their painting, you'll see the landscapes of Kubla Khan, the awe and the terror and the hidden mysteries of earth and air, water and fire. And I just meant to find out what's beyond the turn of those paths they made." He paused for a moment. "But that's not painter's talk," he went on. "I mean, of course, that I've taken a certain school of landscape painting as my starting point, and I will see if I can't develop it on its own lines. I hope to draw something new out of the old." "You have a figure, I notice, in all of your pictures." "You must have the human figure. Without that, all your scenery would just dissolve and melt away. It would be just nothing at all." I did not ask if it was necessary that this human figure should be abhorrent of aspect, for that, I was certain, would not be painter's talk. And soon after I went out into the labyrinth on the hillside. It was late, and the night had grown misty, and the sound of the streets below came faintly, with strange voices. Chapter 3. I remember being told a good many years ago, in the course of a cheerful evening, that the one thing fatal to an actor was intelligence. Or if you like it better, said the speaker, I will say intellect, or, better still, that something or other in a man that can pick a character to pieces and analyze it and find out why it does this, that, or the other, and relate it to the plot and the other parts in the cast, and then, continuing the process, build up by careful reasoning the impersonation out of tones of the voice, facial expressions, gesture, habit of body, and so forth. But, said a gentleman in the company, isn't that the way to act? I thought that was how it was done. That's how I do it, replied the lecturer. But I haven't any illusions. The man who depicts by that method will never be a fierce actor, as the German producer called it when I was in old Heidelberg with Alexander. You know the story of Irving and poor Bill Terrace. Bill was ponging away for all he was worth as Henry VIII. Irving stopped him. Very good, Terrace, very good indeed. I suppose you don't understand the meaning of one single word that you have uttered. No, Governor, said Terrace, not in the least put out. But it'll go all right on the night. That's the way to act. But excuse me, said the man who wanted to know, I'm afraid I don't quite grasp your meaning. What is the way to act? You begin by not being able to give a single reason for anything you do, or for your particular style of doing it. The rest comes along by itself, and I think that I will help myself to another drink ere I go to that Bourne. I don't want to miss the 12:40. It was probable, I considered, that the old actor, a dignified priest in Hamlet, was right in the main. Creative work, even such secondary creative work as the actors, is not achieved by theories or by taking thought. A man must know the grammar of his business, whatever it is. The rest, if it is to be of the first order, must be in the work of the hidden flame within. And, therefore, I have grave doubts of the validity of Macalman's art when I thought of the elaboration of his theories. I remembered Claude Lantier in L'Oeuvre. He made up his mind to be a stark realist, to paint bunches of carrots with sincerity. But he listened to theories and ended by hanging himself before his symbolical picture of Paris as a nude woman, whose flesh glowed with jewels like a Byzantine icon. It was some time before I went to see him again in that retired and secret studio. I met him in Holborn a few weeks after my visit, and he asked me in a very cheerful manner whether I was recovering from his pictures by degrees, giving his short bark of laughter. I told him that I had been allowed out for the last week. But, said I, willing to continue the vein of mild facetiousness, you know art without a story is no good to me. Do tell me the story of that figure in all your paintings, the figure of the twisted man. He stared at me blankly, as if he hadn't a notion what I was talking about. Then he caught sight of an eastbound bus in a slowly moving press of traffic, ran for it, and shook a jocular fist at me from the top of the stair. And that was the last I saw of Macalman for a considerable time. I was occupied, as a matter of fact, all through that winter with affairs and interests of my own. What is generally and conveniently known as psychical research has always had a strong attraction for me, in spite, or perhaps because, of the obscurities, difficulties, and drawbacks of the pursuit. I must say that the usual demand of the men of physical science does not strike me as in the least rational. This demand is, I believe, that psychical phenomena should be made to conform to the laws of the laboratory experiment. The man of science says, I can make hydrogen by a simple process of mixing acid and water and zinc. If you don't believe me, come along now to my laboratory, and I will make hydrogen in 3 or 4 minutes and show you how it is done, so that you can make it yourself, and blow yourself up, too, if you don't follow the directions. Or, if you like, I will make hydrogen tomorrow morning at 11, or tomorrow night at 12, or on Saturday by written appointment. You confess your belief in the validity and efficacy of the hydrogen process, and your scientific friend goes on. Very good, but you were telling me of a woman who looked in a crystal one morning and saw and foretold correctly certain things that happened 50 miles away 4 hours later. Then find me that woman, and bring her along to the laboratory, and let me see and hear her doing it again, and let her explain to me how she does it. And here, I say, physical science strikes me as profoundly irrational. A great poet cannot guarantee a masterpiece to be written on demand under the eye of an observer by 6:50 p.m. Schilliker, the famous bat, would never undertake to reproduce his 250 not out and no chances given against the Patagonians. He knows that when he next meets that famous 11, he may be out for a duck in the first over. And what painter can explain how he does it? Can Dick, Tom, and Harry go to the master, listen to a demonstration, and come away fully prepared to equal his immortal works? Clearly, men are capable of all sorts of performances of body and spirit which are not in the least amenable to the law of the laboratory. Let us remember the historic case of one whom it is recorded, at tip cheese, or odd or even, his hand is out. If Master Tommy Bardell had been required to demonstrate his skill at tip cheese then and there in court, under the immediate eye of Mr. Justice Sterely, he would, very likely, have made a miserable fiasco. So I have always ruled out the scientific demand and its implied conclusion as void and vain and foolish. The real difficulties in these enquiries are to be found partly in the exquisite skill to which the art of the conjurer is sometimes brought, partly to the rarity of the faculty of keen and clear observation, partly to inaccurate and unreliable memory, a little to the commonness of lying, but most of all to the vast and bottomless credulity of the race of men. It is not a case of a plausible tale deceiving a simpleton. It is a case of homely strangers going to a hotel in a busy seaside town, telling the managing director of the concern that they are leaving him a couple million in their wills, and living at the hotel free of payment for 8 or 9 months. What is to be expected when the managing director, the type is common, devotes his talents to psychical research? Still, with all this in mind, I persevered, perhaps not altogether displeased at the thought that, so far as clear and final and general conclusions were concerned, the quest was a hopeless one. After all, there is something eminently human in the desire of impossible things. To seek for possibilities is rather the business of the lower animals than of man. To be more specific, it had often struck me that from the singular phenomena grouped together under the heading of poltergeist, there might possibly, or even probably, emerge a good deal of light on the doings and showings of modern spiritualism. In both cases, naturally, a huge discount has to be made. No doubt, the poltergeist was often a bad child, delighting in annoying, alarming, and humbugging its elders, delighting also in playing the leading part in the comedy. Sometimes hysteria was to be expected, and hysteria is capable of anything. But it seems to me that there was a very considerable remnant of poltergeist cases in which mischief and trickery and ordinary hysteria were necessarily excluded from consideration. As to the other end of the enquiry, spiritualism, its history might, in a sense, be called a sad one. The last time I looked into the leading spiritualist journal, I saw on one page a description of the unpleasing methods by which the medium had hidden the flowers that were to drop later from the spirit world onto the seance table. On another page was a brief announcement that an eminent spiritualist had declared the equally eminent Mr. X, the spirit photographer, to be a highly fraudulent person. For the time, at all events, I decided on occupying myself with the manifestations of the simple poltergeist. And, as it happened, a favorable opportunity came in my way. Soon after my encounter with McCalmont, in Holborn, I ran across an old acquaintance of Manning, who was something in the British Museum. A few years before, when he had been a lodger in Bloomsbury Street, I had been accustomed to see a good deal of him, but he had married and gone to live with his wife on some remote heights up at Hornsey, and we had not encountered one another for some time. we found a nook in which we could exchange such news as we had, and I had heard a good deal about the fine old garden above the London smoke, and of great success with roses. Then came something interesting. 6 months ago, Manning began, we took a boarder. He's a boy of 15, and his father, Richards, an old friend of mine, has got a job in the East, which will keep him there for some years. He asked me if my wife and I would take charge of the lad, for the next year or two anyhow. The mother is dead, and, as Richards put it, he didn't want to leave his son with strangers. The young fellow is a day boy at Westminster, so we don't see too much of him, in term time at all events. Well, he came along, and seemed a decent young chap enough, and didn't give any trouble, till the last week or so, and now we don't know what to do about him. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Stays out late at night and comes home drunk, that sort of thing?" "Not a bit of it. He sticks to his work all of the evening, and goes to bed soon after 10. But wherever he is, things go smash. It began with a stone coming through the dining-room window. I thought, naturally, some hooligan had thrown it from the street and rushed out. The only people near enough to have done it were a couple of quiet old ladies walking along and chatting to each other about the vicar. Another night the clock jumped from one shelf onto the table. Then he went into the kitchen to get me a box of matches, and the plates on the dresser began falling about. It worries my wife, and it bothers me too. Young Richards says he doesn't do it. No doubt he does, all the same. But I haven't succeeded in catching him at it, so far. I suppose I shall have to write his father, and that won't be pleasant. I saw my chance. I told Manning that young Richards must be regarded not as an infernal nuisance, but as an interesting case. On my earnest petition, Mrs. Manning being, I believe, rather glad to have another man on the premises, I became the second paying guest at the Hornsey house, promising myself important and first-hand evidence. And I had better say at once that I was disappointed. As young Richards pored over his homework at a side table, I saw a small piece of Samian ware rise up from the table at the other end of the room, hover, or seem to hover, for an instant, and then fall to the floor, breaking into fragments. I could not see how Richards could possibly be the conscious agent in this event. There was certainly no apparatus of threads or wires concerned in the destruction of the Samian bowl. The boy looked frightened and furious, and I found out that he had been thrashed at his preparatory school for wilful destruction. But from the inquirer's point of view, what next? It seemed that one was reduced to posit an unknown force, devoid of conscious or intelligent direction, and wholly outside and beyond the sphere of physical science. And yet this was something. Richards, in himself, was an entirely ordinary and normal boy, a very decent fellow, I should say, neither too stupid nor too intelligent. It was only in his appearance that there was something not quite ordinary. I do not know that he was short for his age, but his breadth of chest made him appear short, and gave a certain vague impression of deformity, and also of considerable strength. I had been staying with the Mannings for 6 or 7 weeks, and it was drawing towards the darkest and shortest days in the year. There was a succession of heavy fogs, and it was after one of these that the horrible dwarf scare began its course in the papers. A small child, living with its parents in a back street of Westminster, had been sent on some errand to a shop round the corner. The fog was thick down there by the river, but the distance was short. The little girl went to the shop for her mother every other day, and there were no roads to be crossed. She came back crying and evidently badly frightened, having dropped the 6-pen-worth of tea, or whatever it was. When she had been soothed into coherence, she told a tale of a dreadful little man who came out of a passage and bent down with all his teeth showing and put out his hands as if he would take her by her throat and kill her, and then disappeared into the fog without saying a word. Of course, the neighbors came swarming to hear all about it, and deafened each other with conjectures of an impossible kind, and proposed moves and measures which led nowhere. On the whole, it was to be gathered that the horrible little man must be a stranger, since no dwarfs were known to inhabit the neighborhood. The police were called in and made very little of the business, ranking the offender with those tiresome but not dangerous semi-lunatics who cut off girls' hair on the bus or slashed their clothes in the street. The paragraphs in the press were brief, and some people were inclined to think that the small messenger had let the tea or sugar spill into the gutter and had invented the dwarf in order to escape punishment. But then, in a couple of days, there was something more serious. Late on a dismal afternoon, a man who was taking a short-cut through an unfrequented by-street off the Tottenham Court Road felt, as he said, a violent punch in the back, and found himself at the bottom of a flight of area stairs. He was bruised and shaken, but conscious, and as he looked up, he saw an ugly little man grinning at him through the railings. He struggled to his feet and ran up the steps, shouting, "Stop thief!" There were 2 or 3 people about who came running, but they had seen nothing. Then, on another evening, 5 or 6 days later, a girl looking into a shop window in Camden Town became aware that there was a short man with a nasty look on his face standing beside her, and the next moment she felt a piercing pain in her arm, screamed out in agony and fear, and fainted. There was hurry and bustle, shouting and confusion, running here and there from all quarters, but by the time the girl had come to herself and was able to say what had happened to her, the assailant had disappeared. A doctor came up and found a long needle almost buried in her arm. The newspaper paragraphs had become half-columns, and people began to be afraid, and the next outrage of the horrible dwarf was again at Westminster, and close to the place where the small messenger had been frightened, again there was a dense fog, rather a thick white mist, deadening to sound, so that in those narrow streets where there is little wheeled traffic on the brightest days, such noises as there were could hardly be heard, and seemed dull and muffled as if they came from a place far off. But through this thick, stilled silence there broke a lamentable complaint. A man, making his way homeward, cautiously, warily, and slowly, passed through one of these by-streets where, for some years, there had been a patch of wretched and wasted land. 4 or 5 cottages had been pulled down, and for some reason or another the plans for rebuilding had fallen through, and the plot where the houses stood lay as the housebreakers had left it. There were cavernous remains of underground rooms or cellars, brickbat mountains, plaster valleys, all scattered over with fragments of mouldering beams and jagged with slates. A very dismal and ruined place, separated from the pavement by a line of broken-down palings. As the homeward-bound man felt his way along the street, he thought he heard a noise of crying, a very faint, sad sound. He stopped and listened by a window, where the light from within was barely apparent through the thick white folds of mist, and wondered whether the sound came from a child shut up alone and frightened. He could not satisfy himself that this was so, and walked on a few paces, still listening, and thinking that he was drawing nearer to the noise of crying. He was now by the palings that hedged off the waste land, and he became sure that here was the scene of the trouble. He broke through the rotten fence, and went prowling and stumbling about, well aware, as he had often passed that way, that he might very well come to grief himself in the broken-down ruin and confusion of the place. But, with good fortune, he came without disaster to a wretched child, lying on his back amidst the rubbish, sobbing and wailing most piteously. The man gave him a cheerful, "What's the matter, Tommy? Come along, and we'll make it all right," and tried to lift the child to his feet. But the poor misery cried out in sharper anguish, and the man raised him as gently as he could, and bore him away, dreadfully afraid all the while that he might stumble and fall, and, as he said afterwards, do the poor little beggar in. However, he brought his burden safely out of the horrible pits, and rang the bell at the first house he came to. The rescuer and the people of the house saw a terrible sight. It was a poor place, with a bed in the sitting room, and on this they laid the wreckage. It was a boy of 9 or 10. One leg seemed bent under him, and when they tried to straighten it out, the child screamed in pain. But it was the boy's face that frightened them. It was all swollen and bloody, and black with bruises, and the blood was still gushing from the nostrils, which were as if they had been stamped on by the hoof of a horse. One went out and shouted through the fog for the police, and in time the poor boy was taken in an ambulance to the hospital. In a day or two, a little mended and recovered, he told his tale of a twisted man that came out of the mist and took him up as if he would have broken him, and carried him over the fence and threw him down, and then stamped with his feet on his face. The newspapers altered their headline to "Devilish Dwarf," and cursed the police, and so forth. And it was after this most detestable outrage that Manning horrified me one night as we sat by the fire with the rest of the house abed. He told me that he was seriously afraid that young Richards was guilty of these abominations. He urged that they had all taken place at a time when the boy was on his way from Westminster to Hornsey, that he had certainly been late home on the occasions of the first and last of the outrages. He dwelt on his dwarfish appearance, on his great strength, but above all on those abnormal activities which had interested me in the first place. You know yourself there's something queer about the fellow. Upon my word, I'm afraid he's the man, and if we don't do something, it will come to murder. I was, indeed, horrified for a moment when he began, but at the end I laughed, I am glad to remember. I told him that the fog would amply account for Richard's late return on the 2 occasions which he had mentioned, that, to the best of my recollection, he had been back in good time on the other 2 evenings of outrage, and finally, and most conclusively, that he was talking nonsense, excepting only that singular faculty or fatality of his. He's a very ordinary boy, and a good sort. In short, I laughed him out of it. Happily, there were no more horrors of the devilish dwarf order for the rest of the winter. They stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and in the succeeding calm somebody found sense enough to write an article pointing out the helplessness of the police when confronted with the motiveless outrages of a maniac. The new generation heard all about the doings of Jack the Ripper, and the analogy seemed fair enough, and at the same time it was, of course, pure coincidence. The poltergeist activity, or possession, or whatever it was, of young Richards dwindled and ceased. The house on the Hornsey Heights was, in all respects, at peace with itself when I left it for the Valley of London in the early spring. Chapter 4. Extract from a letter received about 18 months after the early spring mentioned above. Now, as to this McCalmont business. In your place, I should certainly go no farther, or further. I never know which is right and which is wrong. There's no question of bringing the story to its logical conclusion, because there isn't one. Your theories and conjectures and the rest of it may be all right, and they may be all wrong. And just remember that for all we know, McCalmont may turn up any day, and that might be a nasty business for you. I remember Sandy McCalmont very well, and he always struck me as a man who would be extremely, shall we say, tenacious, if he got in a temper. I note what you say about your visit to his studio in the spring of last year. In the first place, as to the man himself, you say he struck you as very much changed, silent, morose, and apparently not in the least glad to see me. And I gather that the Lagavulin touch was conspicuous by its absence. I don't think there's much significance in that. There are genial Scotchmen and frozen Scotchmen, and sometimes, and naturally enough, you have samples of both temperaments in one man, and, as I've just said, he always struck me as having a reserve of grimness. One of his race gave me a most cordial invitation to dine with him at his club, and when the evening came, I was going to say he didn't speak a half-dozen words. That's a figure of speech, but, to be strictly accurate, if he had been measured up, I don't think his remarks all through the evening would have exceeded 100 words. He was all right the next time we met. Some of them are like that. You say that all the pictures you had seen when you went to the studio the autumn before had been cleared away, and that there was a new lot on the walls. The change you noticed is certainly interesting. The seduction of the elaborate landscapes into mere backgrounds, the trees barely indicated, the detail shadowy, and so forth. The twisted man promoted from a sort of super to be the real subject of the picture, a devilish figure, as you say, with, I gather, minor demons grouped about him, being instructed in strange traps and chases, in obscure employments, in pastimes that did not strike you as too agreeable. I was rather reminded of an old lacquer bureau I grew up with. I remember one of the drawers was decorated with the design of a golden garden of unearthly trees, in which Chinamen in golden robes tormented a porcupine with long wands of gold. All this was certainly very odd. You didn't like McCalmont's manner when he said, "You asked me for the story of the twisted man, and here it is." I don't see much in that, but that particular gesture in one of the pictures, the man pointing to an indistinct figure on the ground and lifting up his foot above it, well, still, as you can see for yourself, there's nothing you can fasten on in that. You can't charge a painter with the crimes he chooses to paint, and that's the fatal flaw in the whole of your case, if you think you have a case. Of course I remember that awful business of the poor girl in the July following. It was one of the most hideous and revolting things that have happened in my time, and I think that we should both agree that Fleet Street, with all its faults, rendered a public service by its suppression of most of the facts. I knew Selwyn of the Gazette, who was put on the country end of the story. He managed to see a sort of diary the girl had kept, about her visits to London and all that. I don't care to recall what he told me, but there again, when you try to put two and two together, you'll find it can't be done. There was nothing in those papers that Selwyn looked at to connect the unfortunate wretch with the studio. As you say, that square in Bloomsbury where the body was found is not a great distance off, but that's nothing to go on. And, after all, it seems to me that either way you would be well advised to let it alone. The man has gone away, and it seems likely that he will stay away, so there's no fear of any recurrence of these abominations. But, on the other hand, he may come back, and if he did, you might find yourself in the dock on a charge of criminal libel, and I don't think that such evidence as you have is anything like strong enough for you to put up a good defense. I say again, drop it. I took this advice so far as making any representations to the police was concerned. After some years, 9, getting on for 10, nothing has been heard of McCalmont. A cousin of his eventually received authority to deal with the pictures in the studio. Some of the earlier canvases appeared in due course in the dealers' shops round St. James and Bond Street, and others went to the auction rooms and realized very fair prices. There is a movement, I have gathered, in certain circles of art criticism to appreciate McCalmont's work very highly. One critic wrote lately, "It is an old school, if you like, but there is something there that the old school never had, and I don't think that any of us quite know what it is, and I am convinced that collectors, public and private, will do well to keep a very keen eye on McCalmont. At the present prices, they are undoubtedly bargains." And the studios are still asking where McCalmont got his model for the wonderful twisted man. There was one circumstance which I failed to mention when I consulted the friend who wrote me the letter of advice. I am not sure why I left it out of my story, possibly from a whimsical dislike of making the case too complete, possibly from a feeling, equally whimsical, that it was as well to keep one card, at least, safe and secret in my own hand. But 2 nights after the discovery of the package in Irving Square, when the horror was still black and raging, I felt that I must visit that secret studio on the hillside. It was a clear night with the red moon, just past the full, rising out of a low band of clouds, and this time I found my way without any difficulty, and just as I came down the flight of steps that led into the open square, I saw the green door of McCalmont's studio open. Very cautiously at first, inch by inch, and then wider, and a figure, vague against the darkness behind it, seemed to peer about for a moment. Then the door was opened wide, and as quickly shut, and I saw a man, all twisted and bent so as to be dwarf-like, go capering with fantastic and extravagant gestures across the scene of light, and vanish into a narrow passage which led down the hill between garden walls and the shadowy boughs of trees. I stood still, beaten back into the shelter of my steps, drawing a long breath. I had recognized very well that dancing and terrible figure, and I was quite overcome by the utter impossibility of that which I had certainly seen. I had been living for some time with gathering suspicions of some dreadful and mysterious connection between the work of the studio and the horror of the waste place in Westminster, but they had been vague surmises and unshapen fears. But this was delirium, nightmare walking visibly abroad. I shook myself out of my terror and went briskly up to the studio door and rang the bell. The door was opened by McCalmont's handyman, whom I had seen pottering about on my last visit. I asked him if Mr. McCalmont were at home. "Not at the moment, sir," he replied, "but please to step in. Mr. McCalmont told me he'd be back in a minute. He's only gone to post a letter, and I'm sure he'd be very sorry to miss you." I followed the man to the studio, which was all lit up. I stood there in a great bewilderment. "But, William," I said, "I saw somebody come out by that door just as I was coming down the steps, but it was a twisted sort of man, like that man in all of Mr. McCalmont's pictures. I thought it must be the model." The notion had flashed into my mind at that moment, as with a deep sigh of relief. William looked puzzled. "It must have been Mr. McCalmont, sir. There's nobody else been here tonight. He went out a couple of minutes ago." "But the man I saw was twisted, crooked, and he was dancing about like a lunatic." "Then, sir, I think that was Mr. McCalmont all right. I expect he was doing what he calls his physical jerks, thinking there would be nobody about to see him. He says it's strongly recommended by the doctors. But do be seated, sir, if you please." I was staring at a great sheet of paper on an easel. It was covered with black charcoal outlines, to me significant and most awful. I had heard something of the contents of the package that had been found under the bushes of Irving Square. I told the man I really could not wait. I hurried out of the place and struck away up to the north, and made as quickly as I could for the broad and jangling streets, and so got home at last, avoiding dark narrows and short-cuts all the way. I do not know how long William waited for his master to return, but he waited vainly.